So here we are in the rhetorical analysis module, and we've been moving through this semester really fast. We're getting close to the end. This is the last really big paper that you're going to write is in this module, and it'll be something called a rhetorical analysis, which is basically looking at how writers use words to persuade you to think about things in a certain way. So rhetoric is a term that is pretty broadly used. You hear a lot about it when we're in the political season. People are talking about how politicians talk and how people talk about them. Also, you may have heard things like a question being rhetorical, which means the person asking it doesn't necessarily want an answer. In our situation, rhetoric is a term that mostly means the art of persuasion, but also how a writer uses their words to persuade their audience, their readers, to see things a certain way. So when you're writing your rhetorical analysis, you're trying to identify the strategies that the writer used in their piece of writing to do that, to persuade their audience to see things a certain way, to see if they reach their goals in doing so. A couple things. A rhetorical analysis is not a summary, though it includes a small summary of what the writer is saying. It includes some paraphrasing and some quotes, and we'll definitely want to use some MLA citations on those to make sure we're doing them properly. It's also not an argument against or about the topic of the essay. So if you were reading an essay about vegetarianism and you are not a vegetarian, you wouldn't be arguing against the idea of vegetarianism. Or for, if it was something you agreed with. That isn't what this is about. This is about looking at what the writer did to prove their point and if they did it effectively. So it's not about the topic of the essay that you're going to be reading. It's about whether you feel like the writer did a good job writing about their view of it. So to kind of break this down and look at some things in it, we're going to look at the I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King, and it's in your book, Reading for Writers, on page 45. And actually, I would recommend at this point that you pause this presentation and read the speech, or if possible, read the speech and watch it at the same time. Find a YouTube video of the speech. Listen to Dr. King read the speech, because since his is a speech and what we'll be writing about our essays, he uses a lot of oral style to emphasize his points. So you'll hear it in his voice as an inflection. If you see a video of him actually speaking, you'll see it about how he gestures and things like that. And those are things we won't have to work with in terms of our own analysis for this class, but it's an interesting thing to see how he uses those things. So take a break now. Read through the speech on page 45 of Reading for Writers, and then join me again. So let's talk about who Dr. King's audience was. And he does refer to them specifically in his speech. The first group that would be considered part of his audience, besides the people who were right there in front of the Lincoln Memorial when he was speaking, are African Americans. And you can see that in section 4. The first line says, "In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check." So he uses the word "we," and it's a very simple way to talk about who he's including in his audience. And he's including African Americans, both that were present at the speech, and African Americans across the country in general, just with that simple "we." Everyone knows who he's talking about when he says "we." He's also talking about the government because the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment that came out after the Civil War made some specific promises to people of color in the country in terms of their participation in government and citizenship. And even though those amendments were passed, a lot of things happened that didn't allow African Americans to fully participate in America. So actually in this picture here, he's talking to President Johnson, who is the president who made some more changes in the Constitution to make those things, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, more real and doable. So he's addressing the government in this speech, because we aren't quite to completely to civil rights yet, and he's saying, look, you didn't do your job. You need to make sure that you're on top of that. And in Section 5, he does that, but basically by calling the government America, right? It's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. So he's referring to the government, and he's really speaking to Johnson specifically. But then he wants to talk about talk to all Americans, right? All the American people, because he's looking at African Americans being part of all the American people. We're one single citizenship. So he wants to appeal to everybody with this too. So in Section 7, so when he's talking about coming to this hallowed spot to remind America of the urgency of now, he's talking about all of us, everyone. And then it gets a little more specific in Section 26 when he starts naming different things in America. Well, first he quotes the song America, so right, we're all there together. And then he starts talking about the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, the mighty mountains of New York, the heightening Alleghenies in Pennsylvania, snow-capped Rockies, curvaceous slopes of California. I mean, when he's talking about areas that were not part of the South, he's actually pretty flattering and giving them a lot of loftiness. And then he gets to Stone Mountain and Lookout Mountain of Georgia and Tennessee, and he's talking about places that were in the South, or that still are, and were part of the Confederacy, and he still wants to bring those into that loftiness as well. So he's bringing all of America into his audience. But you may find other people in there too as you're reading through, and might find other things that are more specific, like Section 36, where he starts talking about when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Catholics and Protestants, he's trying to pull all of the American people in together as a single audience, so then they're a single source of support. So how does he appeal to his audience? We've talked a little bit in the past about logos, ethos, and pathos and what those are. Logos is about reason and proof. Ethos is about credibility and trust, and pathos is about the emotions. So how does he do this? For the logos, in Section 14, he mentions Negroes' basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one, but he also talks about cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. So what he's talking about is in that period, that Jim Crow period, for an African American person to travel across the country, whether they were going visiting or they were on vacation or they had to travel for work, it was very difficult because they would get to gas stations that would not let them use the bathrooms, and hotels that wouldn't let them rent rooms, and restaurants that they couldn't eat in. They sometimes could buy food from the back door, but they couldn't actually eat in the restaurant. They'd have to buy the food and take it someplace else. So a man named Victor Hugh Green created this thing called the Negro Motorist Green Book, and it was a list of places that African Americans could go to get services and be safe. So safe places to stay, places to go get gas and buy groceries and eat in restaurants and all of those things. And it's called the Green Book because his name was Victor Hugo Green. And there were some other names for it as well. And there's actually a movie kind of loosely based on it coming out this fall, if you want to go see that. But so he's talking about the logic of that. And there was actually an effect of this Negro Motorist Green Book. Sorry, I need to slow down a little bit. Because large companies, large hotel companies and large chain restaurant companies realized they were losing money when the African Americans were not being served in their restaurants or being allowed to stay in their hotels. And they petitioned Johnson to change some of these laws federally so that they could make money. So it actually was a very effective logos. So overall, and so him referencing in that speech was really useful. Ethos, of course, he's connecting himself to Abraham Lincoln in the very beginning of the speech. With his 5 years ago, just echoing the Gettysburg Address 7 years ago. And so he's giving himself some credibility. He also quotes the song America, again, giving himself credibility. And then pathos. Pathos is all over this place, right? He's using all sorts of emotions and metaphors and appealing to national pride, and there's a lot of emotion talking about his children and other people's children, and very strong on the pathos. So that's how he's appealing to his audience. That's how he's getting them involved in this speech. Some rhetorical things. So in your paper, you're going to write about what rhetorical moves that the writer that you're reading does. So he does some things. He has the allusion to the Gettysburg Address. He uses metaphors in section 4, 5, and 6 when he's talking about the check, and he's talking about cashing the check, and he's talking about defaulting on the promissory note, and a promissory note is just a check. He's using this metaphor. He doesn't extend it out too far. He uses it just in a few sections just to sort of give us the idea, a visual idea, because everybody wrote checks back then. These days we use our bank cards, or we pay for things with our phone, or pay for things electronically. But back in the day, everybody had to write a check, and if you had to pay a bill, you had to put that check in the mail. It was an image that all of America really strongly understood. He uses lots of repetition. He uses the I have a dream repetition in several sections, section 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream, over and over and over and over again until that's drilled into your head so much that he doesn't even have to say it anymore, right? They call this the dream speech for a reason, and that's one of the reasons. He just uses that language. And then he goes into another section with a lot of repetition, and he does these repetitions closer to the end of the speech because he's talked about a lot of stuff up to that point, and there's a lot of meat to this, and people might have been getting tired. They've been standing up, they're out in the sun, so he gets into this rhythm at the end that's almost musical, that helps get his audience back involved, invigorated in what he's saying. It's things that they could have repeated right along with them, right? In that whole Let Freedom Ring section from 27 to 35, every time he said let freedom ring, the people standing right there with him could have said let freedom ring. So it gives people an in to the speech with repetition. And then sentence length. And one of the things I really noticed in section 17, which is basically only 2 sentences, that whole section. But what he does is he gives us long sentences, and some of that was probably deliberate because he knew that the speech was not only going to be heard, but it was also going to be printed, and it was going to be passed around, and it needed to be clean in that sense in terms of how people would read it. But he breaks it down into short phrases, so it's also effective in the audio when he's saying it out loud. So he says, go back to Mississippi, end of phrase. Go back to Alabama, end of phrase. Go back to South Carolina, end of phrase. So he's taking long sentences and breaking them up into short phrases, again, to get that momentum going, but also to have it really look good still on the page. So, does he have a thesis statement? What is the thesis statement of the dream speech? Because I'm going to want you to go into the essay that you read and think about what is the thesis. And in an academic paper, like we write, our thesis statements are very clear. They're usually at the end of the first paragraph, and that's where yours are probably going to go. But in something like this, it doesn't have to be as clearly laid out because this isn't an academic exercise. This is a speech, and it's meant to get people involved. It's not meant to get an A, right? So what is the thesis statement of the dream speech? And in my opinion, it's in section 2 where he says, the Negro is still not free. And how I support that, my view of what his thesis statement is in sections 2 through 6, when he talks about the promises made for freedom after the Civil War. So he's laying out his case. Sections 13 through 16, when he shows the proof that Negroes are currently not free, or in that time, not free. And then he goes back to that thesis statement at the end when he keeps repeating the word free and the word freedom. He's reminding us of that state that the African Americans were still in at that point, and his thesis that they have not yet reached freedom. So what you're going to need to do in your own essay is try to figure out what the thesis, what the goal of the essay is. And we may not agree on that. You may read this speech and find a different thesis, and that's fine. Again, because it's not an academic exercise. So his goals in this speech might be broader than just a single thesis. So did Dr. King achieve his goal? Do you think that he did what he set out to do? And I can't answer that for you. That's definitely an opinion. If you go online and read analysis of this speech, and there's stuff all over the place, right? This is a super famous speech, and it's been talked about and analyzed by some amazing writers. But it's up to you to decide, and you'll decide that when you read. Or when you write your own essay, did the person that you read, did they achieve their goal? So that's something for you to figure out on your. So the essay for this module is called the Rhetorical Analysis essay. And just like I just did with Dr. King's speech, you're going to read something and write about how that person wrote. So I've got 4 source essays for you to choose from, and there are links to these in the assignment sheet. They're all online. And what I want you to do is kind of skim over them and decide which one you would like to write about. And then later on in the module, there's a place to let me know which one you've chosen. But if you want to start reading about them now, I think that would be a great idea. Hi, it's me. This is just a little overview of what is in this module. So I just wanted to make sure that I know it's kind of a long module, so that I've covered everything and you know what's going on. So obviously the first thing is this video. Also in there is the reading list. You probably saw that. Hopefully you noticed that even though it's a long reading list from your textbooks, that most of the readings are fairly short. So they're just a few, like this one's only like 2 pages, right? But it's to make sure that we've covered all the information that you need for this module. So as before, the class isn't set up necessarily the same way that the textbooks are, because they're all set up differently. So I wanted to make sure that you have all those readings in, even though some of them are pretty short. And then the assignment sheet, go ahead and look at that, read over it. On there are the links to the 4 source essays, so you can just click on those and it'll take you right to those from the assignment sheet, but there's also a printable version in there if you'd prefer that. In this module, there are 2 discussions in the first couple of weeks, again, to just hone our skills that we need for this essay, and also a short assignment on summarizing that also will help you with that skill. So then there's a short quiz about the readings and this lecture. So over those first 2 weeks, there's just a few assignments, but again, it's kind of top heavy with reading. So I wanted to make sure you have plenty of time for that over those 2 weeks. And then right before spring break, I'd like to know which of the 4 essays, source essays, you're going to write about. So it's set up as a quiz, but it's basically just putting in the information and letting me know which one you're going to do. So that way I can be sure to be ready for that when it's time to grade. And then in the middle of this module, we have spring break, and I haven't made anything due. during spring break. It is completely open so that if you're behind on something and you want to use that time to catch up, that's a perfect time to do it. We're getting into mid-semester, so if you're missing things from the first half of the semester, you want to make sure you get those caught up. Also, if you want to get ahead on this essay, you can do that. The rough draft is due by the 20th, so this will give you a chance to get going on that if you want. And of course, I am available by email over that time. I'm traveling a little bit, but just a few hours at a time, so I should be able to get back to you pretty easily if you have questions. Then there's a second lecture video for this module. Since it's so long, I broke the lecture into more than one part, into two parts, so that this is long enough, right, today. It's not even any longer. So go ahead and watch that. It'll talk about how to organize the essay, because rhetorical analysis essays are organized in a certain way, and you want to make sure that you've done it properly. So I go through one and sample one for you so that you can see how to organize it, which is great. In this are also some videos about how to do MLA citations, and I suggest you save these links for other classes, because there'll be other classes that you write essays in, and these videos may be helpful. So we've talked about MLA before a little bit, but this will help you know how to set up the page properly, spacing and Times New Roman and 12, and do headings and headers and all of those things. So this is, I think, about an 8-minute video. It's not very long, to help you with that. And then how to cite your essay. So the source essays have to have a citation on a works cited page that's set up in a very particular way, right? Everything that you use, you cite in its own special way. So this shows you how to do that, and the person who wrote this, he does a really good job of showing you which pieces of information to pull and how to organize it. So it'll be really easy for you. And then on this one, she shows you from Purdue OWL how to do an in-text citation. So when you're writing and you include a quote or a paraphrase or a piece of important information from a source, she shows you how to set that up properly within your sentence. So it's, again, pretty short but very useful in case you have questions about that. And then this one you may not use for this particular essay, but if you use like EasyBib or one of those citation generators for an essay, this shows you how to clean those up and properly set up your works cited page when you have multiple sources. So it's pretty good source videos for that, so that's why I say to save them for the classes, right? Stick them some bookmarks on them or put them in a folder or something like that. So anyway, so then at the end of this module, there's a short quiz, and again, the quiz is just you filling in the blanks. It's not based on anything you have to have memorized or anything, but it's about the source essay that you're going to analyze to make sure you have those bits of information for your citation and that you understand what's going on in the essay that you read. And then the rough draft with the peer review, and then finally the rhetorical analysis essay.